Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Brian Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. My current home base of Berlin has always been a uniquely nonconformist corner of a remarkably orderly country. It was capital of Prussia, but its rulers didn't want to live here. It came to symbolize Nazi Germany, but Hitler despised its rebellious, irreverent, free-thinking people. And for more than 40 years, it was a symbol of freedom in the face of tyranny. But how did this flat, unpromising patch of sand become the most interesting city on the continent? That's what we'll explore in today's podcast. I'm joined by Lieutenant General Sir Barney White-Spunner, who's written a new book on the city. Barney spent many years in Germany while serving with the British Army. He commanded the Household Cavalry and later the British Airborne Forces. He led British and multinational forces in the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and he ended his highly distinguished career as commander of the British Field Army. He's the author of Berlin, The Story of a City. It's a wonderfully readable book filled with interesting characters that I found impossible to put down. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. So why Berlin? Why did you choose to write a book about this city?
Because it's such a wonderful city. It's such a fascinating city. It is, to me, of all the European cities, it is the most, it's most exciting. It's in many ways the most important. It's the most different. It's the most eventful. If you look at, I'm a historian by background, and if you look at Europe's history, I mean, so much of the major events, the major movements that have shaped Europe actually originate in Berlin. If you go, let's go way back, to being on the frontier, if you like, of what was sort of the Roman world and the barbarian world. You're on the mark. You're on the border, if you like, between the arable lands and the forests and the lakes. You're on the border then between the Roman world and everything to the east. You're then you're on the border of the Holy Roman Empire. You're on the border of the trading routes. It's a great crossover of the trading routes from the Hanseatic cities down into central Germany and then the east into Poland. Then it's on the border between Catholicism and the Reformation. It's where the Reformation arguably starts. I mean, obviously Luther is a Saxon, but actually it is the Tetzels selling indulgences to finance one of the Hohenzollern's archbishopric in Mainz, and actually leads to turns Luther to nail his famous theses to a church door. Then you have the 30 Years' War, which I think is probably the one event that shapes Europe, modern Europe, much more than we realize. Certainly shapes modern Germany much more than we realize. It's actually Berlin that suffers and is affected by the 30 Years' War more than any other city, I think, in Germany. Then you have Berlin as the Hohenzollern capital, the center of what becomes Prussia, the Prussian kingdom, and then becomes the German Empire. It is where Marx experiences such horrific conditions in the 19th century that he goes off to London, writes Communist Manifesto. It is then fairly obviously the city where fascism, sadly, has its roots as well. So to me, everything has happened in Berlin, and I just love this. I first went there as a soldier. I was in the British Army on the Rhine, and one of the first things I did was take the military train up through what was then East Germany into Berlin, and I was wet behind the ears. I was just at university, and suddenly this was the real world. This was a world, which I might have read about, but I had no idea. I never saw seen it sort of front up. And you come to this city, this sort of bright light, if you like, in the middle of that grey world of a DDR. And it just electrified me then, and I've just loved it ever since. It's just sort of, I've always been spellbound by it, and I've lived there for periods on off. I've served there in the army. I've been there as often as I can ever since. But writing about it just gives you just so much of European history comes into it, not just German history. So, actually, a historian, it's a gift to write about because, I could have written about 10 volumes. Don't think the publishers would be very pleased, but I mean,
yeah. Well, there's so much here. I mean, it's impossible to cover even a general overview of the
Yeah.
story of Berlin in a podcast, but I wanted to try to draw out some of the core themes that sort of capture the essence of the city. And you mentioned geography. For a place that's been at the center of so many events, it's really peripherally located. Like, it seems such an unlikely place for an important city like this.
That's so true. And one of the things which, again, fascinated me is why do two fairly small fishing villages on the Spree? Well, let's face it, the Spree is a pretty insignificant stream, really. You can't compare it to the Elbe or the Oder or the Rhine. It's not a great river. How do those two fishing villages suddenly become what is at one point the largest city in Europe? And it is in the 19th century. So I think part of the answer to that is, of course, being on the frontier, being on the mark, gives it that importance. The Hohenzollerns buy the mark of Brandenburg from the Emperor Sigismund. Emperor Sigismund, like all good emperors, is bust. So the Hohenzollerns are a rich and successful family from Nuremberg. They buy it. And of course, by making it their capital, actually you then link the fortunes of the city and the fortunes of a dynasty. And of course, when you look at Prussia at its greatest extent, actually Berlin's in the middle.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I often wondered, why is Berlin so far east as the capital of Germany, around the Polish border? But it would have been right in the center of Prussia.
And of course, the capital of Prussia was even further east. It was at Königsberg, right up until Frederick I moved it to Berlin, when he became king in Prussia rather than elector of Brandenburg. And people also forget that Prussia went, of course, right over to the Rhine. So an awful lot of what we just think of modern Germany, so the area, the Ruhrgebiet, Bielefeld, places like that, they all came into the Hohenzollerns through. Hohenzollerns were good marriers, they had their heads screwed on, and all those territories came in then in the early 17th century. So actually, you could argue the capital of Berlin is a more Western capital than Königsberg. And of course, it's only after the Second World War that it becomes rarely right. It becomes on the border of the free world, on the border with Poland. I mean, it's a really interesting point you make, because I think a lot of people in Europe don't realize just how much those Eastern influences creep in, and I think you see them in German policymaking today. German politicians see things both ways, east and west, in a way that I don't think happens in Paris or London. I think that influence is strong.
Yeah, it does feel very much like a city that faces east.
Yeah,
looks east.
It does, doesn't it? It has that sort of. I mean, it's like Vienna, which is another city I love. You can't go to Vienna, I don't think, without realizing it also faces south.
The city was also located on important long-distance trading routes.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, if you look at the two things that account for its growth, one we just discussed, Hohenzollerns. The second, then, is being on this junction of the trading routes between the Hanseatic ports down into the center of Germany. So the rich, in the Middle Ages, the core, the rich areas of Germany, if you like, were the rich farming lands down in Saxony around Dresden. I mean, Saxony was always the sort of the rich kid on the block. Berlin, Brandenburg was always the poor kid. And those routes down the Elbe and then up the Havel. And of course, actually Berlin is very near the junction of the Spree and the Havel. Well, it's on them, the Spree and the Havel. But then also the eastern routes, the routes coming in again from the Elbe along the Havel, then east into Poland. But it's not just that, because the thing which really, that's happened. Lots of cities have been in that position. But how does Berlin make a go of that? How does Berlin turn that into something? It does it because it has this extraordinarily dynamic, commercially minded population. And one of the factors that I think dominates Berlin's history, to my mind, is the fact it's always been, much more than any other European city or major city, a city of immigrants. They've always been very good in Berlin at adapting people. And I don't know what that is, but it's been like that since the Middle Ages. So, you could set up in Berlin as a merchant, wherever you came from. Christoph Störsel, who might know, who's a quite well-known German commentator, always said to me, the typical Berliner is somebody who's just arrived at the railway station. Now, obviously, it wasn't a railway station in the Middle Ages, but it was the same idea. And commercially, they got their own mint, which was hugely important. They set up their own city government very quickly, but they also demanded that all goods passing through Berlin were offloaded and retraded in Berlin's markets. So, that's commercially pretty advanced. So these two twin fishing villages, which had a bit of fish, good place for wharfing boats, on the junction of these trade routes, have attracted this population that is commercially astute. And the Hohenzollerns, when they first arrived, actually had didn't think of putting their capital in Berlin. They might have put it in Spandau, they might have put it in anywhere else. But actually, they're attracted by this commercially successful, well-off city. So those two factors then play together, and what you get with this immigrant population, this is often in direct contention with the Hohenzollerns, but you do then get this extraordinarily liberal attitude amongst Berlin's population. Now, it doesn't always happen. There's huge exceptions. There's Jewish pogroms in Berlin, like there are sadly in every other European city. But on the whole, Berlin is a much more tolerant, liberal place to live. And although it takes a long time actually to get a university, to get the trappings that go with other European cities, what you do get is this very diverse population who is sort of quite happy doing their own thing.
Yeah, to give a sense of how diverse this place was, you mentioned among the settlers, Burgundians, Huns, Wends, Dutch, Flemish, Poles, Jews, Huguenots, French, Austrians, Silesians, Russians, and anyone who comes here today will see the very large and vibrant Turkish and Vietnamese populations. Even my German friends pretty much all come from someplace else. I can only think of one guy who was born here and grew up here.
It's funny, when I was writing the book, I was trying to find old Berlin families who'd always been there. There are a few around. I talked to them and interviewed them for the book. But it's always been like that. And the Wends, actually, the Wendish bit is fascinating, because Wendish, Palabian, was actually still spoken around Berlin and still spoken in Brandenburg right up until the beginning of the last century. But the Nazis weren't having any nasty Slavic languages like that. So sadly, they got rid of a lot of sort of Palabian communities. But the Wendish influence was very strong. And the other thing that's interesting about it is how it sort of, I think, has shaped Germany as a whole since, in that there are still people like Adenauer who felt that the borders of Germany were on the Elbe. And Adenauer used to say when he crossed the Elbe, he had to draw down the blinds on his railway carriage because he thought he was going into Asia. And he hated Berlin. But there is still that sort of feeling of comfortable Roman-dominated Rhineland Germany, Germany of a comfortable sort of bourgeois states of the 19th century, versus this sort of wild, militaristic, Brandenburg, Prussia, Pomerania, which lies beyond the Elbe, lies off towards the forests and the swamps of the east. And that is still, it's a completely false idea, as we know. It's an idea that still prevails a bit. It's only quite recently that, which is part of the reason is, you know better than I do, the price of housing going up so much in Berlin. The trendy thing for Germans to do now is to have a second home in Berlin, like eventually in Paris, Brits do in London. That never used to be the case. You didn't do that. You might have come and work for the government there. But there's that idea of having a second Berlin home and regarding Berlin, as the sort of place you wanted to have a second home, that's very recent.
What's very interesting too, with all these waves of immigrants from so many different places, as you've said, they somehow took on this distinctive Berlin character. Like the character of Berlin has always molded people who come here. Could you describe that a bit? You've called it the antithesis of the Prussian military cult.
Well, I think it is. I mean, it's a curious combination, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Berliners are quite sharp. Berliners are very direct. Even the taxi drivers, although the taxi drivers now tend not to be German anymore, which they used to have that sort of particular sort of taxi driver patois, like the Cockneys do in London. And it can be an unsympathetic city. It can be a sharp city, and part of a sort of a byproduct, if you like, of being very relaxed and not really minding what anybody else does, is it can make you quite insular. And the other thing is, so they're also quite law-abiding. I mean, as in all German cities are. I mean, we all know the famous story about people not crossing the road when the Ampelmann is red. And the great joke that actually even the wild pigs in the Grunewald now won't cross the road when which I don't know if it's true, but it's a great story. And then, on the other hand, Berlin's always been pretty left-leaning. It's always been quite rebellious and very jealous of its rights and privileges. And actually, it's rebelled 5 times. There's been 5 rebellions in Berlin. The only successful one, fun enough, was 1989, which was the only peaceful one. But there has been also this resistance to authority. And I mean, let's take one particular example of that. Let's take the time when the German Empire is formed under Bismarck, from the 1870s onwards. Between 1870 and 1914, Berlin becomes increasingly socialist. It is a socialist city, effectively, which is something which I think would surprise people if they knew that. The Hohenzollerns didn't really like living there. They did always feel slightly threatened there, which is why they lived out in places like Potsdam, where they lived at Oranienbaum. The great idea was to move out of Berlin, and the city is ringed by these lovely chateaux and schlosses and castles that they built. So there's always been that tension there, and of course it translates through to the Nazis. And one of the things which is always appealing about Berlin is it's one of the most anti-Nazi cities in Germany. Hitler never likes it. He never forgives them for not voting for him in 1933. He puts Goebbels in as the Gauleiter. Goebbels hates it too. And the great set-piece Nazi rallies, which originally were going to be in Berlin, Hitler says, no, they got to go to Nuremberg. We can't have them in this city. It's not a pure German city, which of course it wasn't. It's exactly the opposite. And he and Speer came up with this idea of Germania. They were going to flatten the center of Berlin and build this massive sort of avenue from Tempelhof up somewhere beyond the Brandenburg Gate, where there was going to be a great hall of people. Thank God they never did. And they were going to make it, as he said, a capital fit for the 1,000-year Reich. Well, the 1,000-year Reich, as we know, lasts about 11 years. So
there are a few remnants of this period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you see that load-bearing pillar?
Which?
It's a pillar, giant pillar that Speer built to test the weight of where the Triumphal Arch would have been. So it's down down from Platz der Luftbrücke.
Yeah, Sorry, I have, and of course, I mean, it always amazed me actually how much Nazi, if you like, building is left. So, obviously, the Olympic Stadium, which is a classic, which actually, if you forget the fact it's built by the Nazis, is a pretty impressive building. And I don't know what it's used for now, but the building on the junction of Leipzig and Wilhelmstrasse, which was the old Air Ministry.
Yeah, it's the finance ministry now, I think.
Is it? Yeah, I think it is, exactly. It's the one which has got that mural outside, of the, of the 1953 mural. And that's, classic Nazi building. And then that extraordinary Langemark-Halle down at the Olympic Stadium, which is, I think it's very difficult to see. I don't think it's open to the public, actually.
No, it's not. No.
It is. One of the great things, I think, about Berlin, a man who helped me a lot with this book is a great friend of mine, Neil McGregor, who used to run the British Museum and then was over. He was a key part of the Humboldt Forum project. Neil, when I was writing it, and he helped me a lot with it, said, one of the things that always attracts him to Berlin is completely open about dealing with its past.
Mm.
So whereas a lot of European cities have rebuilt themselves after they've been destroyed in various wars, as they sort of think they should have been. I mean, Warsaw's a bit like that. Actually, Berlin hasn't done that. Berlin's completely open. It accepts its past, warts and all, and lives with it. And actually, the Humboldt Forum, which I know people don't like the Humboldt Forum. I actually personally think it's a really successful idea. And I think it's united the center of a city in quite an inspiring way. And that sort of acceptance of the Nazi buildings, you just get on and live with them. There's still an awful lot of war damage out in the East, which people are in no great hurry to clear up. And then how many cities would actually put something like the Holocaust Memorial right in their center? Not many, I put it to. I mean, and I'm not even certain how many other German cities would have done that. But Berlin is a complete history. Again, that's why it's such a fascinating place. It doesn't try to hide its past. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, you said it's always been a city of tensions, of geographical tension, religious tension, political tension, artistic tension. So we've talked about some of those things already, but how has religion shaped the city? A city today that many would think is, very hedonistic and free-spirited and wouldn't be associated with religion at all.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So originally, it's the obviously the Catholic versus the Reformed religions, the Lutheran religion. But that's a tension you could argue applies in a lot of North German states. What actually happens more in Brandenburg in Berlin is that you get a ruling family who are Calvinist, and you get a population who are Lutheran. And it is that tension which is really interesting. And it doesn't really it sort of solve itself until in the 18th century you get the pietism. And pietism is effectively, I mean, in layman's language, it's a sort of melding of the ideas of both Lutheranism and Calvinism, i.e. individuals approach direct to God without going through a church hierarchy, while at the same time retaining, the services and the, if you like, what people would loosely call the paraphernalia of religion. But that tension is relative tension. There was never actually a huge tension between sort of Catholic and Protestant, if you like. There is a bit. But it's much more the Hohenzollerns realizing, like a lot of rulers did, that actually if you're ruling despotically, as an absolute monarch, Calvinism is quite attractive because people can commune straight to God. You didn't need this whole hierarchy of bishops and that who tell the ruler what to do, and you didn't need to have a cathedral. So Berlin doesn't have a cathedral right until the Kaiser William II builds the existing cathedral right at the end of the 19th century because there's nobody to go in it. You see what I mean? That tension is very it nearly causes rebellion in 1618. I mean, and actually, I think it hadn't been for the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, it would have been a lot more religious tension. And again, it hadn't been for the great elector, one of those much neglected men in German history, where when he takes power after the 30 Years' War, actually is sort of driving the thing forward so fast that almost people don't have sort of time to think about the religious aspects. And then pietism comes in. But it is, for a long time, for almost a century, it's a cause of considerable disquiet and one of the main sources of contention between Berliners and the electors.
Let's talk about those two things, the 30 Years' War and the Great Elector. You said that Berlin has been crucified twice in its life, first by the 30 Years' War, then by combined Second World War bombing and the Soviet invasion of 45. So what did the 30 Years' War do to Berlin?
Effectively reduced it to a village again. I mean, the destruction was unbelievable. So Berlin actually is spared for the 30 Years' War, 30 years. First 10 years, it's actually pretty well spared. The fighting is mostly in southern Germany, Bohemia, in the Palatinate. But actually, towards the end of the 1620s until 1640, those 20 years are just a living hell in Brandenburg. And by the end of it, by the time you get to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, Berlin's down to about a population, I can't remember the exact figure, it's in the book, I think it's about 5,000 with 2,000 houses. So it has completely destroyed the city, but it's deeper than that because you pick up this sort of feeling of fury and deep grief in Berlin that people have worked really hard. They've been building the city up. It had become a really nice place to live. It had a good standard of living. It had a thriving economy. And then suddenly, all this is lost in this senseless fighting, which has no real discernible outcome as far as the people are concerned. It does, obviously, as far as the dynasties are concerned. And I think that actually applies to Germany as a whole. So it's quite interesting how much 30 Years' War still occurs in German literature and German thinking today. And not just today. Schiller, actually writes about 30 Years' War before he writes about anything else. It's almost as if he has to do it to sort of get it off his conscience before he can write properly. You get plays like Mother Courage. I mean, Mother Courage is a sutler in the 30 Years' War. It is, I think it gave Germany a sense of victimhood. I don't think, but Frederick the Great probably knew more about it than I did. He absolutely believed it. He said that actually Frederick the Great was writing obviously a century after it, even longer. He said, we still haven't got over this war, and Germany will take a very long time to recover. And this idea that, hardworking, decent people who's built up this flourishing sort of land, because it's not a country, obviously, of city-states, have just had it all destroyed for them and desecrated for these purposeless armies. And it's interesting how, there's a slight anti-militaristic feeling in Germany today. I mean, it's nothing compared to what it was in the 17th century. And the fuss the Great Elector had in trying to get a German army together. And it's not for 100 years again that actually his grandson, Frederick William I, creates the German army that Frederick the Great will then use to create Prussia. So I do think it is a hugely important area. And the trouble is that we're quite forgetful of history in Europe. We do tend to concentrate very much on the 19th or 20th century. And we do slightly forget that, without stating the obvious, the 20th century came after the 19th and the 18th, if it should have been. I mean, these influences are very much there. And part of the reason when I started writing the book, several Berliners said to me, "For God's sake, please don't write another book about the Second World War or the Nazis or the Cold War." Actually, our history did start before then. And they said, you cannot understand German history unless you look back and you look at these things like the 30 Years' War, you look at the French invasion, you look, why does Versailles, why does the Treaty of Versailles happen? Why does the Kaiser declare the German Empire in Paris, or the king then? And that king is a small boy who's held his mother's hand at Tilsit, while Napoleon and the Tsar have carved up his father's kingdom of Prussia, and the humiliation and the bitterness that created, it leads to this extraordinary German-French tension. It's only recently, one of the things that actually the European project has done is beginning to reduce that, which is fantastic. But you don't understand that unless you actually think of what Germany had been through before.
Well, I guess it's easy to overlook these sorts of periods because they're so complicated and they're so difficult to wrap your head around. I mean, so tell me about the Great Elector. What did that mean, first of all? What was an elector, and how did this fit?
Well, the Great Elector, so basically he inherits the throne of Prussia. Sorry, that's inaccurate. He becomes the elector of Prussia at the end of the 30 Years' War in the 1640s. He effectively moves from Königsberg to Berlin. He doesn't actually officially move the capital, but his son will do that. But what he is one of these really dynamic rulers. If you look at the Hohenzollerns, people tend to judge them by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who is a disaster area. Actually, look at the previous Hohenzollerns. Most of them are thoroughly capable, energetic rulers. The Great Elector is probably the strongest. And so he does two things. Not only does he create Prussia, really as a kingdom, and it's his. I won't bore you with the dynastic details, but it's through his family that he's inherited Jülich, Cleves, and those areas. So he's not only uniting Prussia and creating that as a kingdom. He's rebuilding Berlin, and he's building Berlin as the capital of Brandenburg, and what will then become the capital of Prussia.
At this time, what we would think of as Germany today is just a bunch of small kingdoms, or
bunch of different, not that small, all of them. I mean, Prussia is, under the Great Elector, Prussia becomes, having been so say we go from being the Mark of Brandenburg to Prussia. And that is something that happens largely on the Great Elector's watch, if you like.
So what's the role of an elector?
He's there to elect the Holy Roman Emperor. When the Hohenzollerns bought Brandenburg from the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, they brought with it one of the electoral seats. So there were 7 electors who used to elect the Holy Roman Emperor. And there were endless spats always as to who they were going to vote for. Lo and behold, it always ended up being a Habsburg. So although it was technically elected, all the Holy Roman Emperors were Habsburg. So it became a slight sort of anomaly. But there were 3 clerical and 4 temporal. But it was a title. It was a great position to have. So the Hohenzollern rulers of Brandenburg were known as the electors of Brandenburg. So he is called the Great Elector. And then it's his son, Frederick I, who becomes the first king. And again, through some rather tiresome detail of dynastic precedents, he's king in Prussia rather than all Prussia, but we won't bother with that. But it is the Great Elector who really, and his 2 wives, who really give Berlin, the feeling the city has today. It's under them that the Unter den Linden is laid out, that you get Friedrichstrasse, you get Wilhelmstrasse. His second wife was a bit of a property speculator, and all that area north of the Unter den Linden up to the river that is all developed by her, and she makes a tidy profit out of it. And he may also fortify Berlin, because even though the 30 Years' War is finished, Berlin's never going to go through this again. So it was a huge project to build rampart-style defenses around Berlin. And again, you can see them. So if you often wonder why the S-Bahn from a Hackescher take a bit of a funny bend, well, it does it because it was following the line of the old Ravelin, the old rampart that the Red Nectar put up. And those only rarely finally come down in the 19th century. You can still see evidence of them today all over the center of the city. So he's defended it, but his other great contribution is, he sees the value in Berlin's immigrant population. He invites the Jews who are being persecuted by the Habsburgs in Vienna to move to Berlin. You get a very strong increase in the Jewish population. And although there will, again, sadly be Jewish pogroms after him, they're few and far between then. But then he's most famous for bringing the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, mostly from France, who were persecuted by Louis XIV when he revokes the Edict of Nantes. So basically they are told that their religious practice is no longer legal in France and their property is confiscated. The Great Elector sets up an embassy in Paris. Literally, it's like modern refugees from Syria or Afghanistan somewhere. They are welcomed into Prussia. They're welcomed in Berlin. And by the time he dies, population of Berlin is 25% French. So, this is significant. So he's actively encouraging, this sort of Berlin, this multicultural, multi-ethnic Berlin, in a way that doesn't go down particularly well with some of the native Berliners or the Prussian landowners. But it's hugely successful, and you don't need me to tell you how French influence is in Berlin today, or how if you wander around Berlin, you see an awful lot of French-sounding surnames.
Was this because they brought new skills and new trades to the city?
Yeah, so exactly that. You're rebuilding a city that's been destroyed in the 30 Years' War. You need the people, you need the skills. Exactly. Sorry, I should have said that. Yeah, they are skilled craftsmen and artisans. They're bankers, they're metal workers. They're smiths, they're porcelain makers, they're cloth workers, and these are the trades of the time. Obviously, we're a century short of an industrial revolution yet, but these are the really important artisan trades that will allow Berlin to rebuild. To me, I think he's one of the great European rulers of all time. The Great Elector. He's an interesting man. He's robust. He's humorous. He's a successful military commander. He doesn't get on with his son, but then none of the Hohenzollerns ever did. I guess that's par for the course. Then his son is Frederick I, who becomes the king, and people again are very critical of, but he is the man to whom we owe the Berliner Schloss, and actually the Schluter facades and the Humboldt Forum, and we owe Charlottenburg, which was built for his wife, Sophie Charlotte. And we owe an awful lot of the sort of beginning of the artistic renaissance that will come once the Great Elector has got the commercial renaissance going.
So you say that it was Frederick the Great that actively encouraged the development of the arts and sciences and is widely credited with kind of the cultural renaissance of Berlin at that time. Yeah. So what stamp did he put on the city?
It's so interesting. So you have, if you like, Frederick William I, so you have the Great Elector, his son Frederick I becomes king. His son is Frederick William I, who is always portrayed in German history as being a bit of a sort of martinet and a military good for nothing. Actually, he's a canny and very successful ruler in a slightly idiosyncratic way. He builds up the army, which then Frederick the Great uses to take Silesia to defeat the Habsburgs to create, the Greater Prussia that will become Germany. Frederick the Great is an anomaly, because he is very influenced by the prevailing French fashions that are dominant in 18th century Europe. So he thinks the height of sophistication is the French language. With the famous exchanges with Voltaire, he builds up the opera. He loves French music, French literature. He hardly bothers to speak German. He thinks German is a barbaric language which doesn't have the correct expressions. And he lives at Potsdam at Sanssouci, which you will know, glorious sort of pavilion, if you like, with its wonderful gardens and views. But he's isolated increasingly from the real Germany. Yes, when he's fighting his wars, he's very obviously in the thick of it, and he is creating a country which is an autocracy. I mean, he may have been an enlightened man, but he was an autocrat. He was a despot. But increasingly, while he is at Potsdam, it's also developing his sort of French court, Berlin is saying, well, hold on, we're German. This is a German city. And running in parallel with Frederick's cultural, well, it's not really Renaissance, but his cultural sort of thoughts, his cultural feelings, if you like, you have this development of beginning of the very early stages of a German Enlightenment. As you get to the end of the 18th century, after Frederick the Great finally dies, and as the Germans said, he takes a long time about it, you actually have the beginning of this incredible period in Berlin, which will be dominated by the French occupation. But that is the area that is producing, the great writers. It's producing the Nicolais and the Lessings. It's producing the Schinkels. It's producing the Humboldt brothers. It's producing a very German way of looking at things. And I always think quite a nice contrast in styles is if you look at Sanssouci, which is effectively a French sort of Rococo over-the-top pavilion, compare it to the Humboldt Schloss Tegel, which is built, admittedly, a bit later, not a huge amount later, and look at the difference in styles. Schloss Tegel is German. It is a German building. It is disciplined, solid, square, attractive, ordered, clear, clean. Sanssouci is sort of over the top, flowery, rambustuous, bursting out all over, if you see what I mean. And these are very reflective of the two movements that were going on. So why that's so important is that Berlin Aufklärung, as they call it. I mean, Aufklärung means lots of things to different people in German, but basically it means sort of the artistic experimentation. It is actually what comes to be the core of what drives Germany and German nationalism. And that is heightened by the defeat of Napoleon, by clearing the French out of the German states. And eventually those are the movements that will lead to Frankfurt, will lead to the creation of Germany. So it is an extraordinarily important period, I think, to understand and to be clear about that. So Frederick the Great is a great king. He's a great commander. He's a great Prussian. I mean, again, hugely important in the history of Europe. But actually, in the history of Germany, it's actually probably what's going on in Berlin that is more long-lasting.
What impact did Napoleon leave on Berlin?
Well, pretty negative. I mean, the French occupation was quite unpleasant. It wasn't necessarily totally brutal. It was brutal in places. I think it was a sort of casual arrogance of Napoleon that and his troops that got people. I mean, as you probably know, a lot of Germans were so fed up they left, came to England, formed the King's German Legion to fight against Napoleon. The occupation of Berlin was it was so dismissive, really, of everything German. It was basically, if you like, sort of going back to that Frederick the Great idea that French is good, German is insignificant. The fact that he actually carved Prussia up. So, I mean, he leaves Prussia about half, I can't remember exact figures, of population of what it was. And then you have this awful moment at Tilsit when he meets the Tsar on the raft on the River Niemen. And that is when young Wilhelm I is there with his mother holding her hand, while his father is excluded from the talks between the Tsar and Napoleon, which are going to carve Prussia up. It is like so much Napoleonic. It's incredibly ill thought out. It's so temporary. And that's what's extraordinary about Napoleon, isn't it? Actually, for a man of that vision, he was incapable of putting in place sort of structures that people could live with him a long term. They were always going to have to fight against them because they were unsustainable, because they were so sort of crushing you. I think that's really his biggest impact. There's not much physical impact of the French occupation in Berlin. It was mostly this sort of sense of deep humiliation of, we are as good a country as you are. And again, I think maybe his greatest legacy, ironically, is the enormous sort of energy he gave to the German Enlightenment. he gave to this idea that Germany, if the Germans, why do we want to speak French? We'll speak German. I mean, the Iron Cross is designed for people who, the first Iron Crosses were awarded to people who resisted the Napoleonic invasion. And that, why Iron and the Iron Cross have become such an incredibly important German symbol. People say ignorantly sort of think it's a Nazi thing. Of course, it isn't. It's deep into the German psyche, designed by Schinkel again.
There's another person who left such a profound legacy in Berlin, Schinkel. What an incredible, multi-talented man.
Extraordinary man. Man. I mean, and him and the Humboldts and that whole generation. But Schinkel is amazing in that quite how diverse his talents were. I mean, he started designing theatre sets, designed furniture, painted, but he is rarely as an architect. And I think why he's so important to Berlin is, of course, that whole sort of feel of Berlin to me is Schinkel.
Yes, yeah.
That, but sort of the idea of the Mietkaserne, which not necessarily the Mietkaserne is him, but the frontages of them, and that idea of getting a feel of a street. And I mean, I think it's so extraordinary about Schinkel is how diverse he was. So he's perfectly capable of building the red brick Gothic church opposite the Humboldt Forum. At the moment it's all wrapped up in and still got some false facades up. But he can build and experiment in all sorts of different styles as well as art forms. But I think what's really important about Schinkel is he gives definition to this. He's the artistic definition of Germanness, if you like. Of course, he doesn't do the Brandenburg Gate as people often think he does. He's after that, but I mean, he easily could have done. You see what I mean?
Yeah, you mentioned the Mietkaserne. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Berlin is the fastest growing city in Europe, and it would become the largest capital in Europe by area, but also the most sparsely populated. But sparsely populated in terms of is very spread out, and there are a lot of green spaces and forests. But it seems like there was always a housing crisis, and
there was. I mean, and it's yeah. So I mean, those two things again, which may be seemingly contradictory, are that actually, as a metropolitan area, it's one of the least densely populated in Europe, and having things like the Tiergarten and the Grünwald are enormous advantages for the city. But of course, where the poor could afford to live, in the centre, the housing conditions in the 19th century were terrible, and the Mietkaserne idea is an unsatisfactory answer to housing conditions. But what is really interesting about the Mietkaserne, which I think people largely overlook, is that people from totally different income brackets lived in the same building, just in different bits of it. So you could have the rich living in the smart apartments looking out on the street at the front, and the poor living in sort of grotty attic rooms at the back. And people trying to defend the system would argue that was socially cohesive because you had the children from the smart families and the children from the poor families all playing together and going to school together. It actually didn't work like that. But and there were, of course, again, although there were obviously sort of poor families in the centre of Berlin, actually the poor families tended to be pushed out onto the periphery, not out in the Grunewald, but in the Kreuzbergs and the Schönebergs, the Weddings, whereas actually in Mitte and Charlottenburg and the centre areas, you obviously had the richer families. But they're extraordinary phenomenon, Mietkaserne, because I mean they're there now. I mean they're pretty solid, most of them. I mean the two building types that define Berlin for me are the DDR tower block, blocks of apartment blocks, which you probably know well from quotes, and the Mietkaserne. I mean, however much they were bombed or shot at by the Russians, most of them have survived intact, been rebuilt. They were solid buildings. But I think people forget just how bad the conditions were. Conditions were bad in most European industrial cities in the 19th century. But I think Berlin was particularly bad because it grew faster and bigger, and in a pretty uncontrolled way. If you look at what causes the trouble for 1848, the revolution 1848, although that is in many ways, fun enough, a bourgeois revolution, it's a bourgeois revolution fueled by the overall conditions. the DDR would tell you, of course, it was entirely a proletarian revolution. It wasn't. That's not true, but it was certainly fueled by it. And you've probably seen the cartoons. I put one in the book. But if you the great Zilla cartoons, I think I put one in here. There's actually a Zilla museum, Nikolai Fiotil, at the moment, which is worth seeing. But Zilla, if you like, sort of captured that. He lived in one of these meat casernes when his family came as refugees, and described the absolute horror of it.
Is it also where that strong sense of locality comes from in Berlin? That sort of identity with your particular Kiez?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, and you must notice that living there. I mean, it is very much a city. I think that's also partly because the city expanded. It took in villages and village sort of communities, and people made a lot of money out of speculation. There are bits of Berlin, as you know, where you can still sort of wander into the outskirts and find the parish church and the village green, as it were, literally. But I think it's partly that, and it's partly that the idea of everybody living together concept, which I don't totally accept, but I mean to a certain extent I do.
Yeah, it's very much a city of neighborhoods. It's always felt that way. That was one of the other things that surprised me from your book, that it's kind of from early on the northern and eastern districts tended to be working class districts, places like Wedding and Gesundbrunnen, whereas the west, like Schöneberg, Charlottenburg, Wilmersdorf, it was always middle. Like I always thought that was a result of the wall years. Not I didn't realize it went so far back.
Yeah, it goes back a long way. It's interesting, isn't it, that the of course the wall, in good German orderly fashion, law-abiding fashion, the wall followed exactly the boundary between the different areas of a city. Was not, because that's where the people ended up. But of course, they didn't. It was all under Russian occupation to start with. It was actually because, and originally there was no French sector. It was just British, American, and Russian. But it follows exactly where the boundaries, the district boundaries ran.
I didn't realize it was the other way around. I always thought the wall caused that. Yeah, it's interesting.
No, absolutely no. It was. It was. I mean, that all goes back to the great mayor in the 1920s. Who reorganized the metropolitan structure of Berlin, and laid out the district boundaries. And I joke in the book that he's the man who actually set the boundaries of the free world, unknowingly in the 1920s. I can't remember his name. I'm looking it up, but it's But yeah, no, it is that. And actually, fun of it's when you look at the Soviet sector, it actually was. It didn't the nice. Well, it had the middle. I mean, it had the internet, and it had the palace. It had the island. So it had all the sort of government center. But I guess the sort of richer, nicer bits to live were all in the west.
So Berlin's time as a cultural and intellectual center seemed to peak in the Weimar period. That's my favorite period and I think many people really relate to this period in Berlin, is this great cultural renaissance. Tell me about that. Like, what was happening in the city at that time?
Yeah. You see, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I would put it to you that the 1920s was probably the most miserable time in Berlin's history. So it was fine if you were a visitor. It's fine if you were in the sort of elite. But for most Berliners, it was a time of pretty abject misery because, well, for a start, you probably have lost a family member in the First World War. After the First World War, we have chronic unemployment. We have a real shortage of food. We have street violence. We have hyperinflation. We have a government having to move out of Berlin because Berlin is effectively ungovernable, so it moves to Weimar. It moves back from Weimar. There's more, I think, more trouble. You then have a great crash, the depression. Then you have a street fighting between the socialists and the Nazis. And you have this inexorable rise of the Nazis, so well described by men like Isherwood, until the 1933 elections. Arguably, from 1933 on, Berlin actually does have 6 years of, or actually rather longer. It's the beginning of the war. It's fairly untouched. Quite a good period. But I think the 1920s are miserable. So yeah, I mean, it is it's a great time in many ways artistically, but it's shallow, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't actually. It's almost a sort of a sort of reaction of sort of gay abandon. I mean, I guess you get a bit of the same in other European cities. You get in London and Paris. It's a bit of reaction from the First World War. It's a bit of the sort of gaiety after the horrors.
But there are some elements that last. Like you have the German expressionist painters, the Die Brücke, and these experimentalists, and the great expressionist filmmakers. So we have like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Metropolis, and that's the part that interests me. That on the one hand is so miserable and so violent, and this end of the world kind of feeling of, Europe on the brink again of complete and utter destruction seems to spark some of these types of artists. That's what interests me.
Many of who then have to go abroad in 1933, or soon afterwards, they realize what's happening. Which, hence my point, is actually quite. But yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, it's always sort of said to be summed up by that sort of cabaret. They just redone cabaret incredibly well in London, actually, but that sort of revolution idea. But yeah, there is, and there is in literature too. I don't think it's a deeply popular culture. I think it skates over the surface, I'm afraid. I absolutely get your point. I mean, some very talented artists and writers and that are working, but I think that it's a culture of sort of challenge, which doesn't really have the deep roots. Fun enough, I think the almost deeper rooted Berlin culture comes in the 1890s or 1910s with men like Uri and Liebermann and people like that, where you get this in much more sort of honest, proper expression, incredibly popular works, which are still hugely popular now, fairly obviously. But yeah, I mean, I was talking to some people the other day, about this, and they said, if you were born in Berlin in say 1890. Your life has been pretty wretched, really, wasn't it? Because you have the First World War, you have the 1920s, you have the Second World War, you then had the wall and the split, and by the time you may just have made it through to 1989, but you wouldn't have had much time to enjoy it. So I regard the 20th century as a pretty dark period for Berlin, to be honest. I don't knock what you're saying. I totally get some very talented people, and some of the great authors we know, were writing them. But I don't think I'm not certain how deep it goes into Germany.
They seem to have quite a large influence abroad, perhaps because they had to flee.
Well, they exactly. I mean, a large number to America. Those who could afford it, and those who could actually, find somebody to take them. It wasn't that easy. So it was but okay, look. So let me give you another artist who maybe sums it up better for me. Katja Kollwitz in the that Pieta in which is now the National Memorial in the Guardhouse on the Unter den Linden. Yeah, that in a way says more to me. Her art says more to me about the 1920s than others. The sense of loss of a national loss, the sense of grieving. It goes back to about 30 Years' War idea too.
So would you say it was the assassination of Walter Rathenau that sort of marked the end of this period? There's no turning back now. Like the Weimar era is doomed.
I don't know if it was particularly that. I think Weimar was rarely doomed because of the economics. Assassination of Rathenau was was one of several murders that have been carried out by these squads. But I don't think it's necessarily that sort of turning point in itself. I think it was symptomatic rather than of the general sort of lawlessness of culture. That slightly actually proves my point of what I mean about how this is a slightly false culture, because it's not false culture, that's the wrong word, but it's actually a culture that isn't reflecting what's sort of going on in the society underneath. It's sort of a bit like the sort of Dada idea, isn't it? But yeah, no, I think what really does for Weimar is after the inflation, you've had recession, and I mean, the rise of the Nazis is horribly explicable. I mean, it's horribly logical.
it was the recession that tipped the balance that saw them take power?
I think what rarely brings the Nazis to power is economic despair. Really, it's the idea that the people would have put up with Versailles, put up with like national humiliation if they'd had savings and jobs and even food and housing. But I think the degree of, again, as I say in the book, I think that degree of misery created first by the inflation and then by the recession was that extraordinary story in the Bielenberg book about her gardener saying to her that talking to Frau Bielenberg about his aspiration to get married, saying that he'd saved up money to get married. He'd just about got enough. He'd strived all his life. He was just about to propose. His savings suddenly became worthless, and all he was able to do was to buy his wife, his intended fiancée, a cup and saucer, and they had to scrap their arrangements because they couldn't afford it. I mean, that'd be like, it's that desperation that, to me, is what does the damage. There's nothing in there. It was a system that's completely failed us, if you like, or we failed ourselves. I mean, systems have failed us. You've always got to say, well, you're part of a system. But, actually, Germany has failed itself in that respect.
So you said earlier that support for the Nazi Party in Berlin was far lower than the rest of the country.
Yeah.
But one of the things that surprised me as well from your book is at the same time, much of the warped ideology of the Nazis was based on ideas and movements that originated in Berlin. So you cite the Prussian militarism, the nationalism of opposing Napoleon, and the salute as well.
The salute, yeah, all that, yeah. But they're perverted by the Nazis, aren't they? I mean, they're not sort of purely. What's interesting about the Nazis in Berlin is support was much stronger in the outlying areas in the city centre. So areas, Potsdam, Oranienbaum, areas like that, actually were really pro-Nazi, right in the middle, certainly in the working class districts, but even actually in areas like Charlottenburg, Tiergarten, and that it wasn't nearly as strong, and it was weak in the solid working class districts, like Reading and Kreuzberg, and that's where most of the socialists came from. So, but again, I think it gets back to this idea that the Berliners just don't like that idea of sort of a strong military authority, which was so immediately apparent with the Nazis. But Hitler never really forgave him for that. I mean, I think he had aspirations that Berlin would sort of come behind him, but as we said earlier on, he couldn't see it working, and it seems so tragic that Berlin, which would suffer more than any other German city from Hitler's war, should be so anti him and what he stood for.
Yeah, the image I think that summed it up best for me is you described when Hitler announced that he had invaded Poland.
Yeah.
And you say the Nazi hierarchy were surprised and annoyed to see the streets empty.
Yeah.
There were no cheering crowds, no flower throwing, or a general mood of excitement and celebration, as there had been in 1914. Even guys on a building site didn't even stop to listen, basically.
I think it's very telling that. I think it shows just how much opposition there was to the Nazis in Berlin. And if you look at the resistance movements in the war, there were some really brave Berliners who ran underground movements. There were all over Germany, true, but particularly in Berlin. I mean, there were in Munich and Hamburg too, but just in Berlin, it seemed to crystallize.
And the other thing that really struck me too was the how much Germany and Berlin had lost. Like when the Enabling Act is passed, you have this great cultural exodus of the city's Jewish and artistic communities.
I tell you what's a really good, interesting thing to do, to give you an example of that, is go. If you go into the Humboldt University, that main building on the Unter den Linden, opposite the Babelplatz, called the Forum Friedrichianum, as the old Berliners call it, and that's actually his old Prince Henry's palace, Frederick the Great's brother's palace. Go upstairs; they don't mind you doing this, and just look along the first floor corridor. And there's a whole row of photographs, portrait photographs of some of the great sort of academics, Berlin academics who fled, lucky ones who fled, several who were sent to concentration camps. just gives you an idea, an example of it. That actually this isn't just the sort of the Manns and the Grosses and people like that, the famous authors going to America. It is actually, it goes deeper than that. It's that a whole sort of intellectual class. And if Hitler's wondering why in 1945 he hasn't got an industry that works or a country that functions, it's because so many of the people who made it function, have left. It starts much earlier than people realize this. People saw the writing on the wall, and started to go from the early 1930s. And it's only later that actually you get the Kindertransport and you get the sort of a tragedy. There is a new museum. I don't know if it's opened yet, but the Museum of Emigration being set up in the Anhalter Bahnhof. I mean, you've got the German diaspora that results. It's quite a lot of people will go back eventually, but it does enormous damage. And then, of course, you have the whole Jewish pogrom that happens afterwards. So in 1930, roughly, there were probably about 200,000 Jews in Berlin. By 1939, about 75,000 remain. And by the end of the war, that's down to about 5,000. So it's pretty horrific, isn't it?
You have a story about the pogroms. You quote a local woman describing men smashing the windows of Jewish shops. You say there's neither hatred in them nor indignation, neither frenzy nor anger. The onlooking crowd is silent and unemotional. Is this a spontaneous rage of the people finding vent, she asked herself? No, nothing of the kind. But if those 5 were ordered tomorrow to kill all the chimney sweeps in Germany with flails, they would go to it and leave no one alive. They would be without passion and without mercy, not because they hated chimney sweeps, but because they loved obedience, loved it so much that even the soul stood to attention before it. That's an utterly chilling image.
It's a horrible quote, isn't it? I mean, but it really is. I think it sums it up. That was Ruth Andreas Friedrich, who was a resistance leader, became quite a well-known resistance leader. But what's so sad about it, particularly in Berlin, is, of course, for Jews have been so much part of Berlin's life. And yeah, there have been, as we said earlier, there have been pogroms in the early 16th century. But Berlin, of all the cities in Germany, if you like, had the greatest degree of Jewish emancipation. I'm sure people take issue with me and say, no, there were lots of other cities that that had a wonderful Jewish record too, and I think some did. But certainly Berlin, had its feel, and it was a great synagogue. You can see it now, restored synagogue. It's only the front of it. Obviously, the rest of it was destroyed. But I mean, it was. I mean, that was there before the cathedral. It's part of the reason that actually the Kaiser insisted on there being a cathedral. So yeah, no, it's a tragic time that.
Finally, the Nazis are gotten rid of, and the troubles of Berlin are far from over. You have the Soviet occupation, and technology and industry in Berlin came to an end at that time. I didn't realize that either. I thought it was. I thought that was also a result of just being so isolated because of the wall, and being so far east. I didn't realize it was because the Soviets looted absolutely everything that was and wasn't nailed down.
It's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, it's a combination of that, of them looting everything, and an awful lot of museum treasures, which we might come back to. It's also the fact that, of course, as Germany began to very slowly recover, we had the airlift and the cutting off, so you couldn't get stuff in and out of Berlin. And by that stage, people were worried about Berlin's future. So they wanted to invest. They invested on the Ruhr. They invested in a solid, safe Germany. So it's a combination of those factors. But yeah, it does. I mean, that is a major change, again, one which I think people don't sort of notice, that after the war, Berlin becomes a financial and government center. And of course, it wasn't always the financial center. It only became the financial center in the 1870s. It wasn't the traditional financial center of Germany, which was again down in Frankfurt.
I didn't realize that it had been such an industrial center as well. I mean, the center of electricity and.
You're speaking from Siemensstadt.
Until I moved to this neighborhood. I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary to have a neighborhood of a city named after an industrial company, isn't it?
This entire district, it's massive.
Yeah. And Germany had more homes in Berlin had electric light before they had running water. That is one of the great losses. And again, it's one of the great sort of credits, I think, to Berlin. But actually, they rebuilt like a society and an economy, based on something completely different. I mean, the Soviet rape of the city was, I mean, it's so pointless so much. On Earth, then most of those machines then sat in railway sidings, never been used. I mean, it was almost sort of, it was part vindictiveness, part just sort of inquisitiveness, and part just, why have you got this when we want it, sort of thing. It wasn't, things weren't taken to a plan. And some of the raiding of the museums was, equally pretty disgraceful. And a lot of that stuff is still in Russia. A lot to come back. And one of the triumphs, I think, of modern Berlin is Museum Island, and the way that they've actually, reunited the museums.
So the other big period that everybody wants to hear about is the Cold War, and I'm hoping to do an entire podcast on life in the DDR. So rather than go into those details, I wanted to ask you about your own experience. So you mentioned earlier this was your first military posting. I mean, when would that have been roughly in terms of sort of East-West relations? Like, what was the city like at that time?
Well, it was still, the wall was still well up. So I mean, it would have been when I first said, late 70s, I think, or early 80s. And it was actually quite a difficult time in East-West relations. I remember being, when you took the military train up from West Germany and you went through the DDR into the Berlin periphery, you had to do a handover to a Russian officer. I remember being absolutely terrified meeting this Russian officer. What was he going to be like? Was he going to be some sort of communist who tired over me? And turned out to be a very geeky guy who just wanted cigarettes. And it sort of brings the world sort of back to reality. But it was still very tense. We were still in West Germany. The Allied armies, German, American, British, were still being mobile. We sort of had practiced crash outs against Soviet threat. And of course, as we all know, when organizations, countries like the Soviet Union are coming to their end, they're that most dangerous. And it was a worrying period. This was pre-Gorbachev. I mean, this was the end of it was Andropov, really, wasn't it? It was the end of of Brezhnev and Andropov, and that very sort of uncertain period. And people were nervous. And going through, it was the extraordinary contrast in styles between East and West. And you went through Checkpoint Charlie. We went in uniform, and you wandered around East Berlin, and it really was, like it was another world. It was grey. There were people hurrying, looking at their feet in sort of rather threadbare clothes. It had this air of sort of gloom about it. The city was still in a terrible state. So, I mean, a lot had been rebuilt. A lot had been rebuilt, actually, from 1973 when they had the Berlin 750th birthday. A lot hadn't. And the buildings were still pockmarked with bullets. Actually, some of them still are. You drive out east to the Oder through Berlin now, you still see a lot of bullet marks in all the buildings. And you get into the shops and there was nothing in them. And you'd feel, we used to change our Westmarks for Eastmarks at a very advantageous rate. The official rate was 1-to-1. Well, of course, nobody was going to give you, one Westmark for an Eastmark. So we would change at a much better rate. And you could go out to dinner, you go to the opera, you go to concerts, you could buy things, ridiculously cheap. Then you felt a bit uncomfortable doing that because these East Germans would look at you and think, this is not right. And I suppose it wasn't right in many ways. It was spooky. It was a very threatening environment. And I remember going to his restaurant called Ganymede on Schiffbauer Damm. Have you been?
I know it, yeah.
You go inside rather than sit outside on the pavement, and you'll see, the painted interior. That was there in the 30s, and there was a band there at the end of the war who were quite famous, and some of them were still playing when we were going there in the late 70s. I mean, ancient, and it was something so sad about it. Here are these guys who'd still playing away, having almost like sort of a Titanic, playing through all this depression and violence and war. Obviously, they're all long since dead now. But then it was only 35 years after the end of the war. So, a hugely impression on me. It's part of the reason really that I've just had such fascination with the place ever since. It gets under your skin, Berlin. It's this unique experience. It's like nowhere else in Europe.
How free were you to travel back and forth over to East Berlin?
Totally free. I mean, you had just had to tell you again, but I mean, under the four-power agreement, three-power agreement, the French came in later, and we didn't talk to East Germans, we only talked to Soviets because we didn't acknowledge them. So under the military government, you could go, and they would come over to the West, not very much. The Soviets didn't really let their people, but they did occasionally. You would see the odd, Soviets come over, but you had to be in uniform, and you just drive straight through checkpoint Charlie. And when the East Germans tried to stop you, you sort of ignored them. And the East Germans would try and stop you coming up and down. We used to drive from West Germany up the Autobahn into the city, and the East German police would try and stop you, almost as a sort of dare. And again, you just ignored them, and which infuriated them. But there wasn't much they could do about it.
Well, you described an incident in the book where they kind of tried to push their way like this, and it ended up with tanks facing off against each other right at checkpoint Charlie.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, but yeah. I mean, that was before I was there. That was earlier. That was, but that's a famous photograph. Yeah, I mean, there was a real tension. It was a well thought out strategy, actually, having forces in Berlin. And I'm always amazed that Stalin allowed it at the end of the war. And I think he then bitterly regretted it. But of course, once they were there, if anything happened to them, that was a sort of tripwire, if you like, which the Russians couldn't afford to let happen. So even though they were tiny numbers, and we were a brigade, we were called the Berlin Brigade, and the Americans had, I think, had slightly more than the French had. He had rather less. The French actually just took over two British areas in the north. I mean, they weren't originally part of the Ultra Agreement, and we actually had a very sort of unprivileged life, and you were almost sort of slightly not above the law, because you were subject to your own law, but I mean, you were almost, well, you were an occupying power, really. And of course, they're really good at understanding and accommodations reached with West Berlin. And the relations between West Berlin and the Allies, were excellent. I mean, we were rallying very rapidly, but all part of the same alliance as Germany came. Although, of course, West Berlin was technically separate to West Germany. It was an extraordinary time. I'm sort of quite privileged to have seen it, but then you think of a huge sadness and misery it caused for so many people. You also think it's a very sad time.
It's strange, like communism seems to be on the rise again, in the sense that these sort of self-described anti-capitalist students and activists in the West are turning to this completely failed ideology that caused so much misery for so many deaths in so many places. Why do you think that is? Like, have we forgotten the lessons of the Cold War?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there is memories are very short. I think there is always going to be movements that protest, and that's healthy and normal in society. But if you're going to protest, you need some sort of ideology, and the ideology of sort of those who don't have against those who have is a very tempting ideology to adapt, but it does ignore the huge sufferings that most of the young generation don't really have much first-hand experience of, either in Russia or particularly in China. I mean, China is really extraordinary because if you think of a huge suffering inflicted by Mao, and but actually you think now how the Chinese Communist Party has reinvented itself. So I mean, he called himself communist, but it's no more communist than you or I are. I mean, it's a completely different way of looking at the world. So I guess what other ideology is there? I mean, when there was a rather idiotic book published called The End of History, but any society needs a sort of an anti-force. It needs something to polarize around, to say it can polarize its opposition. And I guess there isn't really an awful lot else at the moment which if you like, encapsulates that need for those who have less to be represented against those who have more. I think it's more that than a real. I don't detect a huge return to Marx or to Marxism-Leninism. I think it's more it's more a sort of a slightly naive form of social conscience, I think.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. It seems to me as something that's so easily solved by travel. I mean,
Oh God,
you just have to go to the formerly communist world or a currently communist country to see how absolutely miserable the life is in these
and
places.
my daughter spent her life going to North Korea, which she
Yes, yeah, I've been there 20 years ago.
oh yeah, I've never been. I mean, I've said I probably can't go because
No,
they'll probably shoot me.
I don't think you'd be allowed in. No.
But she says absolutely fascinating. I mean, she was just mesmerized just how completely horrific it is, really.
Hmm.
So people don't. You're right. People, too much travel. I'm afraid is to lie on the beach and it's. I mean, I'm sure like all of us, I reckon I learned more in the year I left school than I did all my time at school. Really, just traveling around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I guess just the memories fade as well. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I vividly remember lying awake at night being terrified that missiles were going to start flying over.
Yeah,
I mean, I lived in a very small town on the St. Lawrence River, so like we were right on the American border, but
yeah,
80 kilometers from Ottawa, roughly. And
yeah.
I don't know if Ottawa was important enough to be flattened, but
Yeah, I'm sure Ottawa was on there, but that is, it was a frightening time. I mean, and it was, I mean, I go back to my time in Germany. It was only, I think, once we got into the mid '80s, it became clear that, well, I think it became clear that the Russians were inept, right? They were unable to do what we thought they might be able to do. It was still alarming. Then again, why Berlin? Get back to Berlin. That's why that was so fascinating for me because it was like a real manifestation. Here was this bad communist world close up. Here were these people with funny hats and and silly walks and tanks and shops with nothing in them and people being miserable. That was my education, if you like.
and this it must have been quite a threatening feeling too to be this little isolated outpost of civilization surrounded by massive numbers of Russian troops.
Yeah, you didn't really feel that so much, I don't think, as a soldier, because you were sort of coming and going. I think for the Berliners it was. I mean, West Berliners, in the 60s and 70s, they had a real difficulty in keeping the young population there. And you had, what was that benefit you got? It's got some German nickname, I can't remember what it is now, where you actually got tax allowances and benefits for actually agreeing to stay and live in Berlin. You were exempted from conscription, although an awful lot of Berliners did go and join the Bundeswehr. I mean, the whole idea was to actually keep people there, but actually there was a real fear that it wasn't sustainable. And it wasn't clear in the 70s at all that the wall would come down. And I think there's a lot of heart searching in Bonn and Berlin as to, we've got to keep this place going. How are we going to sustain it? Hence all the incentives for investing there and living there. And I think in a way, that drove a lot. Rather, you were saying, I was slightly disagreeing with you about 1920s. I think actually there's an awful lot of cultural interest and development in Berlin after the wall goes up, for exactly the reason that people want to. That sort of sense of threat, that sense of isolation, gave it a particular sort of frisson. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, it was a similar feeling to the 20s, that feeling of kind of being on the brink of disaster and everything.
Yeah.
It sort of speeds things up in a sense.
Yeah, no, exactly that. Yeah. But are you going to stay living there now? Are you going to?
Right. For now, yeah, it's been 6 years. I mean, as you say, it's a place that we just kept coming back to over and over to visit year after year. We were living in Malta at the time, and chance to sublet a place came up here, and we jumped at it. And the longer we stay, the harder it is to leave, it seems.
Yeah. It's an easy place to live, isn't it? I come and go. Actually, not so much for and the last few years I've been coming and going endlessly, and you just sort of you get there and you feel you've always been there. You just sort of slide into it. There's no getting you. You don't acclimatise to Berlin. You're there. As they say, you arrive at the railway station, you are a Berliner. It doesn't judge you, Berlin, at all. You don't notice that. You can do anything in Berlin, really.
Mm.
And that is a bit of a hangover from not just the 1920s. I think it's always been a bit like that.
Yeah, that's what interested me in your book too. That core thread of character that the city has. No matter who comes here, they seem to be just assimilated to this particular Berlin character, and the character of the city somehow, the spirit of place, sort of carries throughout.
It really does, actually, and I mean, actually, I love that bit of Germany too. I mean, I love that sort of something about those rather flat Brandenburg countryside, which I need to explore a lot more. I've got lots of to come and do so.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. So the book is called Berlin: The Story of a City, and anyone who knows Berlin will enjoy it as much as I did. And those who haven't been here will, I think, read it and find themselves planning a trip. So thank you very much for taking the time to discuss it with me, Barney. I've really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's lovely when people enjoy my books, and it was a huge fun to write. And I'm delighted to have been able to share some of it with you this afternoon. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.